Welcome back to the 239th episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, including a drug bust article talking about how removing the fentanyl actually may hurt a lot of communities and individuals in the United States, how the clearance rate in some police departments is abysmal, and some solutions that may be possible, as well as a really hard on crime bill that's coming through Kentucky. And of course, we will end today with our daily delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. Now, that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump in to our daily debate. So, we've talked before about the war on drugs and whether it's worked or it has not. And I want to know your opinion. Have you seen your community get more inclined towards drug use, or has it stepped away from it? And let's be clear, it's really hard to see when your community steps away from it unless it's been really bad and it's gotten better. But do you hear about more people doing drugs? And I'm not including marijuana because it's legal in a lot of places. Or have you seen your community take the steps to get away from these certain practices? I'd love to hear what everybody has to say. You may be like, why does it matter, Alex? You'll understand here in a little bit what I mean. You'll get a little bit more context. So with that, let's jump into our first article that comes from the Daily Beast with the headline reading, Fentanyl police busts actually make the overdose problem much worse, which was a very interesting first line when I was going through yesterday morning, and I was like, okay, interesting. Let's see what they have to say here. Because intuitively, and I say intuitively, even though I'm a person who doesn't like the drug war, intuitively your thought is, okay, hey, at the end of the day, when the police bust a drug dealer, a person who's shipping them across, a smuggler, or anyone in their cartel, your instant thought is, okay, well, we're going to see a little bit less of this drug in this community for a while. It's probably not going to be too long. They're going to find a new way to get a new supply. They may start cutting some of their drugs, so on and so forth. And you say, well, it may end up being okay. But the Daily Beast is definitely not on that page. They are saying, no, it's totally ineffective. It actually makes things worse, which, of course, by the headline you could tell. But let's jump into the first and second paragraph from this article. Quote, each seizure saves lives. That's what New York State Police Acting Superintendent Stephen James said last month after his team seized 5,000 fentanyl pills. But are ever-increasing fentanyl seizures a sign that we're finally winning the war on drugs? Not even remotely. Indeed, the evidence shows the opposite. Fentanyl seizures don't save lives, they take them. So this is a pretty bold claim to lay out at the very front end of your article. And for those of you who may be really intimately involved, or at least knowledgeable about the subject, you may say, Alex, I mean, yeah, we've known this for quite some time. I'll be honest, I did not know this for any amount of time. I just read it, I was like, I'm a little skeptical here. I'm not necessarily feeling it. I understand at the end of the day there are negative repercussions, and they may be more long-term, but it feels like right now that should be kind of a solution. I understand that some people are going to be really hard-pressed to find different drugs, and that may make them a little bit more exasperated, and it may make them a little bit more desperate. But at the end of the day, the idea of these seizures is not to harm the every average day user. It's to de-incentivize the action of selling it and make it more expensive for the people selling it. So I didn't necessarily think about the ripple effects onto the people necessarily. I was thinking more about the distribution network, especially when you're doing a bust like this. I mean, the one they're talking about, 5,000 fentanyl pills. You don't think, okay, at the end of the day, this is going to negatively harm, possibly kill a lot of the users. At least in my mind, I don't instantly jump to that. I think, okay, we're shutting down some of this distribution network. We're making it more difficult, so on and so forth. I already highlighted why I was thinking that way, or at least that I was thinking that way. But these authors are trying to make you say, okay, you understand, most people understand that it's going to become harder to get these drugs out there. But what does that actually mean for the people that have been taking those drugs for quite some time? And it's not that I don't care about these people, it's just that I had never taken it that far. Because even as a person who's a little bit more libertarian on some of these issues and says, hey, the police should stop being so harsh about these criminal penalties, I was thinking more in a use term basis. Like, oh, okay, hey, they're found using, they go in for an overdose, and then the police try to question them or try to say, okay, hey, what was going on here, and pressure them into going into rehab or giving up the dealer or other things like this. I thought for a long time, hey, just let's back off on that sort of thing. A person can do what they want with their body at the end of the day, and it becomes very, very annoying when you have the cops trying to determine how these people can actually go about living their lives and then trying to extrapolate information about them, pressure them, and send them to jail in some instances, because at the end of the day, these policies are extremely harsh, even on the people who are addicted and just the end of the supply chain, so to speak. So let's jump through some of the reasonings that the Daily Beast provides. First, deaths increase in the immediate aftermath of the seizure as frantic customers adjust to the supply disruption. Kind of what I was talking about earlier. It makes sense. Those who don't, keep a stockpile, who are desperate to go from pill to pill because they, at the end of the day, they're not doing well financially, so on and so forth. They're going to have a hard time finding that new stuff. And if they don't necessarily know the dealer that they're going to, they may get a different mixture, they may get a different cut than they normally do, and that could actually cause an overdose. Quote, second, deaths increase over the course of years as producers and dealers adjust to repeated losses by creating more potent drugs that are easier to conceal, smuggle, and distribute. And this is something that happened with heroin. It was really, easy compared to some of the other drugs, meth or crack or anything like that, to get into these states and, into the United States and then into different states, because heroin weighs less. It's able to be packaged more in smaller packages in order to get somewhere. And then fentanyl, which is double as potent essentially, so you can have half of it and still get to the same market, supply them for the same needs. Well, then, you're going to be able to distribute that easier. You're going to be able to get it across the checkpoints easier. You could even send it in on people, physically on people, and you could have a similar effect rather than having to take it through ports of entry where the likelihood that you get caught is a little bit higher. So it's very interesting, the argument they're laying out here, which is, if it becomes hard to transport something, if the risk of transporting it become harder, they're going to find better ways to transport it. Or if the undue effect of these drug busts are, hey, we actually just need to get, maybe the same amount in weight into a market or a little bit less in weight into a market, but it needs to be able to serve double that market, because we have to be okay with the idea of the police seizing a little bit of it. So we're going to have to increase its potency. And that's what happens with these illegal drugs, these synthetic drugs that are a lot more potent, because the drug cartels say, okay, well, hey, at least if they seize half of this, we can still do a lot of work on the other side. We can still sell to a lot of different people so that they can get their high, they can get their fix, and we can still make our money. So I think all of those points are very well laid out, or at least the beginnings of them are. And the article goes on to a lot more depth on most of them. But I want to really cover the short term, because you can think about the long term. I have thought about it before. It definitely makes sense logically. The short term is something that, like I said, I have neglected in the past, so I want to cover that one to break it down. Quote, start with the short term. When local law enforcement conducts major drug busts, they do temporarily disrupt the market for street drugs, but people who use and have grown dependent on the drugs do not simply give up drugs and live clean. Now, it's true that they might take days or weeks for drug users to connect with a new dealer. This might seem to save lives, but often backfires because by the time they find a new source, users' tolerances have waned. So yeah, that's another good point that when I first read it, it made a little bit of sense to me. Even if you're able to survive the withdrawals, you're still going to want that fix. You're still going to have that burning sensation that you need to use. And then because you haven't used normally if you're a once a day user, that's not necessarily uncommon. Then yeah, most people aren't. They are every few hours. Like they'll do their morning hit, then they'll do what they have to do. Maybe they'll do a hit at lunchtime or something like that, and so on and so forth. But if you're even a once a day user, and you come around and you say, "Hey, can I get this?" The dealer says, "Hey, we're out. The drugs were caught by the police, so on and so forth." And they say, "Oh, okay. Well, hey, I'll try to find a new place." They can't, but they say, "Okay, you'll be ready in 2 days, so I'll just stick it out." And then the signs of withdrawal start to come in probably around 3-4 days, and then anything they do after that is going to be, the effects are going to be much more drastic because their dopamine receptors have been shut off, or at least have been so tampered with that they're not ready to deal with this large influx of synthetic drugs that create dopamine. And then the dopamine releasers, the second they get these receptors, the second they get that new dopamine, it's an overwhelming feeling. It's like, whoa, buddy, we're back in action. So that sort of thing, yeah, that does actually make a lot of sense to me. There are people that I've known who, even after taking a 1 or 2 day break from things like nicotine when we were younger, they would get really, really buzzed, more than normal, they felt like. And of course, it's not the same because these drugs are absolutely 10 times they're 10 times higher on the scale of potency, on the effects to your dopamine scale, and addictiveness as well. So obviously not on the same scale, but if the point still stands for something that's lower on the scale, then I bet it's a lot more shocking when you go up towards these more deadly, intense drugs, more addictive, more dopamine-releasing drugs, so on and so forth. And the reason that the short terms are important is because we really do have to think about the immediate aftermath. So if you're going to do all these drug busts, you should probably have, and let's be clear, I'm not saying that, in every city we do a drug bust, we have to have these resources. But it's one of those things where when people advocate for allowing different groups on the streets that have Narcan or that have different resources to provide for these people, whether they're faith-based rehabs or whether they're just general rehabs, we have to actually have those conversations, especially as we want to bust down on the trafficking of these drugs a little bit more, because there are short-term after effects that may end up hurting people. And let's be clear, I'm not saying the government needs to focus on that. I'm also saying that the police need to totally stop this process. And let's be clear, I think they probably should. But at the end of the day, I don't think that's practical. I don't think they're going to. They need to show that they're doing something. So we need to say, okay, this is now our responsibility on the outside. If you can give a little bit of money to some of these different programs that provide Narcan or addiction overdose services in some of these cities, maybe you should do that. It would be you interacting with the free market and addressing the situation as it is, not being hopesy and ideal and saying, oh no, we're going to make sure that the government can't get involved whatsoever. I mean, at the end of the day, they're going to get involved. We don't necessarily, as private citizens, you probably don't want them involved, but do your best outside of them first before we end up bringing them in anyway. I know that sentence didn't necessarily make sense. I structured it a little bit weird. But at the end of the day, we don't want the government addressing this. We want to address this as a third party or as a member of the society, because the government's already screwed up one half of it. Let's not let them screw up the other half. And I want to read this last quote from the article because it kind of rung through me when I first read it. Quote, during alcohol prohibition, beer and wine became bathtub gin and became bootleggers smuggling whiskey into the country. During prohibition, an average of 1,000 people died each year from tainted or denatured alcohol. Consider the recent surge in fentanyl deaths. In 2012, Mexican cartels mostly added fentanyl to heroin to boost its potency so they can smuggle it into smaller packages. The drugs were often smuggled across the border overwhelmingly through U.S. ports of entry. But in response to COVID-19 pandemic in March 2020, the U.S. banned non-essential travel from Mexico, massively restricting the numbers of crossers, freed up personnel to search on a higher percentage of crossers, leading smugglers to switch to a more lethal but more concealable fentanyl. So it speaks to what we were talking about, the long-term effects of some of these policies and the drug busts and the constant need to innovate in order to beat the laws. I did a Twitter tirade on this the other day, and it's sort of like having an outside pressure in a market, is how I put it. So sometimes the Fed comes in and tries to regulate different markets and say, hey, you have to use this green technology. And companies, because that green technology is expensive, they don't like being told what to do. They don't want to buy carbon credits. They innovate. They try to create new products or new devices that do similar things to what the government wants them to be done with the other device, but they don't have to license it or buy it from somebody else. They can do it all in-house. And, that's a very rare instance that actually happens. But my point being, that's the idea. You have an outside pressure here coming in from the side of government. And then the people who are making the money, they're saying, okay, hey, we got to adapt. We got to change up the system a little bit. And they are finding new ways to make synthetic drugs and ship them into our country. And they're finding new ways to addict people to their product. So it's, I don't want to say scary. It is very, very unfortunate. And we need to take a serious look at these sort of policies. I go back and forth. At the end of the day, I think anybody should be able to destroy their body or use their body however they may wish to. That doesn't mean I think it's good for the society. Doesn't mean that I would want it around my kids, so on and so forth. But we have to seriously look at the limiting of freedom. And also, even if you do believe that the government needs to crack down on it or at least do something about it, we can obviously see this is not the way to do it. On a practical level, it is not coming out the way that the government thought it would when they first issued a drug policy, or at least the good amongst them did, versus the more cynical ones who were trying to go after their political enemies on the ground. I'm not going to say who I'm talking about, but if you listen to a lot of libertarian podcasts, they bring it up a lot. And I'm not saying that it's 100% true because it's kind of a sticking point. Maybe one or two people said some iffy kind of things, but it's just definitely a talking point. So if you listen to libertarian podcasts, you've probably heard it a whole bunch. So let's jump to our second article that comes from Real Clear Politics. The headline reads, Law Enforcement's Abysmal Clearance Rates. So when I first read that, I was like, okay, clearance rates, I know that term. Why do I know that term? Basically, it's looking at the amount of crimes that are closed properly or there's some sort of official resolution. So whether that be they arrest the person, they find that it was a false claim, so on and so forth. But that was not the case, or at least that's not what we start the article on. We do talk about clearance rates, but the first reason that the article is even out there is highlighted within the first paragraph. Quote, in Houston, a scandal recently broke when it became public that the police department had closed the investigation of over 250,000 crimes, with the code indicating that the case was being dropped for lack of manpower. The cases closed included thousands of murders and sexual assaults. The department did not inform victims or their families that the investigations were being closed. Had been closed. So That is absolutely horrific. And you can see why it's an inspiration for writing this sort of article, really breaking down whether or not these police departments are able to do their jobs. Even though the author doesn't 100% buy into the idea that it is solely based on manpower, he's definitely saying that it has a big thing or big effect on whether or not all these police departments are actually clearing some of these cases that they have. And there is a nice little chart that the author provides us here, which highlights the clearance rate on different types of offenses or different types of crimes. And I just want to read them out to you because, goodness gracious, is it horrifying. Murder, the clearance rate, the percentage is about 61%. Not the best. I would be kind of upset with that number, to say the least. Grape is 33%. Yes, YouTube doesn't like the word, so we'll go with that. Robbery, 31%. Once again, abysmal. Aggravated assault, 52. At least, assault aggravated of some kind. Really angry combatants between two people. At least it's above 50%, but still, don't know. Burglary, 14%. Larceny, 18%. Auto theft, 14%. And 24% for arson. Those numbers are absolutely abysmal. You're saying that basically no category except for aggravated assault and murder is it above a 50% chance that your case gets solved. And even murder is probably inflated simply because and I say simply, because it is one of the worst ones on this list, and they can get, I don't want to say they can get lots of news coverage, but they have people completely dedicated to these sort of things like detectives versus these other ones that may not have. I mean, burglary and larceny, do they have their own department? Do they have their own special teams for those? Maybe, maybe not. Some departments probably don't have the manpower for it. So it's really interesting. And the thing is, this is just this year's. This is not in comparison to 2019 or 2020, or if you go back to 2010. So they do have a breakdown on the FBI website that talks about all of these different ones. And these numbers are from 2019. So we don't have comparisons as to the years before that to see if rates are falling, if rates are increasing, so on and so forth. So the author has this chart here for us, and then he goes on to explain how this is related to the manpower issue. Quote, law enforcement predictably responds to criticism of their embarrassingly low clearance rates by complaining that it needs more resources and personnel. There's undoubtedly some validity to their claims, but Americans are already spending vast sums of money on law enforcement. Estimates may vary, but the consensus is something around $200 to $300 billion annually. That is nearly $400 to $600 per person, and funding has continued to grow with little or no improvement in clearance rates. And what the author goes on to suggest, which I thought was a pretty clever suggestion, and I say clever in that there is at least something to it. It's not like it's the new innovation, but it's something that we kind of overlook a lot of the time, which is you have designated desk personnel who do all the paperwork, who can handle all that for everybody. You basically specialize the departments rather than keeping some officers who have been trained to do the job out in the field. Instead of giving them desk duty, you hire a civil servant or a bureaucratic person, essentially, who sits inside the office, does all the paperwork, calls everybody, texts everybody, emails everybody, says, hey, was this a 1044 that you called in? What was the arrest date? I think the signature here may be wrong. Can you tell me what the name of the person was? So on and so forth. If the cops can remember it off the top of their head. And they sit in the office and they do multiple people's paperwork so that those people are freed up to go and do their job on the streets. Maybe you need 2-3 of those per department. Maybe you say, okay, for murders, we're going to designate Lonnie. Lonnie, you're going to do murders, and since murders don't happen that often, we're also going to give you some of the more frequent things like arson and grand larceny, and you're going to just sit there and do the paperwork while everybody else is out there actually trying to enforce the law and protect the citizens, and you sit back and help us protect them by making sure we don't have to waste time on the paperwork. Or maybe they bring in old officers who know the paperwork system. It doesn't have to be special civil servants. Bring them out of retirement or give them some sort of extra bonus in their pension, because almost every single police force is unionized from what I understand. So then say, hey, from your union pension, we're going to add a little bit of extra bonus if you come in and just do paperwork 1 or 2 times a week, and try to bring these people back in without having to pay them full sums, so we don't have to spend even more money on it. Those are all interesting solutions, in my opinion. The author kind of has an issue with bringing in old cops into the fold, but I think that could be an interesting and worthwhile kind of endeavor. So we'll see if that one pans out. Hopefully Houston is able to get some more manpower behind them and they can start up in those clearance rates. And let's be clear, those rates that I mentioned are not just Houston. They are nationwide, I do believe. So it's obviously something that needs to be addressed on the nation scale, not just in Houston, but it was spurred for the author by their resignation of a lot of different people, or the saying that they can't actually get their job done in Houston because they don't have the manpower necessary. So let's jump to our final article. It's going to be a really brief one because it is a little bit of local news, but I live in Kentucky, at least when I'm not on the road, so I do very much enjoy every once in a while seeing what's going on with Kentucky. And I read this and I was like, wow, okay, Kentucky coming down hard. This article is from The Nation. The headline reads, Kentucky is about to pass the cruelest criminal justice bill in America, which is really hard to believe, in my opinion, because there are lots of hard bills. I mean, when I was growing up and going through civics class, California was one of the examples of the hardest sort of criminal law that existed with their 3 strikes policy. Well, when I first thought that 3 strikes policy, California is going to be up there. California is obviously revising it a little bit, and guess who's taken up a 3-strike policy? That would be Kentucky. Quote, on March 14th, the Kentucky State Judiciary Committee voted to approve HB 5, the Safer Kentucky Act. The legislation will head to the Senate floor for a vote, and it will most certainly pass. The 78-page bill criminalizes homelessness, criminalizes the use of deadly force against individuals engaging in unlawful camping. So it decriminalizes, Under the law, it is if a property owner believes an unhoused trespasser is attempting to commit a felony or attempting to dispossess them, they can shoot the homeless person. And there's a whole bunch of other things that go on into this bill, but I want to read the 3-strike policy because I think that is a very important thing that is not going to go over well with the populace, because at the end of the day, we've seen how it worked in California. Sometimes people, even though it did dissuade certain types of crimes, some people are doing something that they didn't realize was a serious crime, and then they can get some sort of felony for it, or they can get thrown in and get a bad charge, and then they have 1 strike. And then because they already have the 1 strike on their record, it immediately expedites them next time, and it could be an extra felony when they get their 2nd strike. And then I'm not saying I'm not saying that at the end of the day it's, whoa, they accidentally got 3 felony strikes. No, but maybe it exacerbates them just enough that they get really frustrated, and they go and do something really stupid, or maybe they accidentally fall into the first one, and because of how tight things are and how much the government's trying to dissuade the 2nd and 3rd strikes, it actually prompts a more easy falling into for just desperate acts. Now, yes, don't commit crime and you won't have an issue, you won't have a problem, but at the end of the day, the homeless population, they don't always have options. So it is interesting. Now, let's be clear. I do think that states need to find ways to disincentivize homelessness and homelessness encampments in cities. That doesn't mean I necessarily agree with the 3-strike policy, but Kentucky's going to do what Kentucky's going to do. So, quote, this bipartisan campaign has reached the Supreme Court, which will end a hearing in Grant Pass versus Johnson on April 22nd, effectively determining whether cities can punish people for sleeping in public. Should the court rule this permissible, which is likely, it could have a domino effect on legislation and ongoing lawsuits protecting the unhoused. across the nation. The part of HB 5 that makes it unlawful in certain circumstances for people to shoot homeless people on their property will only encourage reckless gun ownership. To kill first, ask questions later. Kelly Sampson, director of racial justice for the nonprofit Brady, told CBS News last week. And there's one more quote that I wanted to read before we move on. Quote, when the bill came to the House floor, Kentucky politicians cited 117 academic resources to argue the bill would absolutely, unequivocally lead to safer communities and less crime. But when Representative Baumann released the list of citations, a Kentucky Public Radio review found that 40% of the cited articles appeared to have no or little to nothing to do with the legislation. And of course, everybody's going to have their spin, but it is interesting to see that we're using some things that don't actually justify your point and extrapolating them and whipping them around and turning them and shaping them into what you want them to be. Now, I have not gone through all the articles, and I don't know the news radio station in question here, so it could be very biased, and they could say, no, this actually has nothing to do with it when there's one or two relevant sentences about it. But it's definitely an interesting conversation. Keep your eye out, because even if Mr. Beshear, the governor, vetoes it, they basically have a veto-proof majority in the Senate, so they'll be able to get it through, no problem. They've basically been governing like that for a while, even though Beshear's been pointless at the top. The Republicans have just overridden him a whole bunch of times, and then Beshear gets to take credit for some of the things that they do. At least that's how I perceive it from talking to people in Kentucky who are politically active. Then again, maybe I need to talk to some more people that are politically active who don't lean one particular way or the other. So let's jump to our daily delight. And this one comes from Outdoors.com. Video. Chunky black bear squeezes himself under Tahoe porch. And when I first read this, I was saying, okay, why? Is he going for food? Is he just chilling underneath? He just thinks it's a cave. I think at the end of the day, we're going with the assumption that we think it's a cave. He thinks it's a cave, and he's just trying to stay warm, and he's not necessarily going for food. Quote, in his original post, Salish wrote that the bear likely weighed 600 pounds. Despite that size, he was able to squirm through a crawl space that's just over 2 feet high. According to Schlich, the bear, known as G101, has spent the last 3 years in South Lake Tahoe area. And if you want to see the cute video of this guy rummaging through the crawl space, or you want to read any of today's articles, there'll be a link in the description below that like and subscribe button where you can find all of them. Also down there, you can find the link to the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Casts, Google Podcasts, as well as Podvine, and the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip, where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. So, with all that said, there is only one more thing to say. Stay safe. Don't die.